Good afternoon. This is Charlie Stile, political columnist for NorthJersey.com, The Record. Tuesday, we have finally the rescheduled long-awaited primary here in New Jersey. But like everything else this year, in the year of the pandemic, it's being held under extraordinary circumstances. This is going to be the first primary to be conducted by vote by mail. Primarily vote by mail, and there's already been some administrative glitches, problems, even a touch of scandal with that. And there's a good chance we may not know the election results, Tuesday's election results, maybe for a week, possibly longer afterwards. But we have some, now usually primaries are low turnout affair, but we have some pretty interesting races, particularly in South Jersey. And looming over this all, of course, is the President Trump and the presidential election in the background, the November background. So I brought with us today to discuss all these different elements, some of New Jersey's sharpest political minds and political analyst, Benjamin Dworkin, who's the director of the Rowan Institute, Public Policy and Citizenship. I have to look at that title. That's a long one. Thank you for giving me that extra time. Ashley Koning, who is the director of the Eagleton poll at Rutgers University, and Matt Hale, who's an associate professor in the political science department at Seton Hall. I know all of us reporters here in New Jersey rely on their wisdom and insight. So we're going to hopefully tap some of that here today. Ashley, I wanted to start with you about Trump as a backdrop to this race. His fortunes are declining. Even with I've seen some polling data suggests that even older white voters are abandoning him. So, how much do you think? Again, this is a primary, but his shadow is being cast on this race Tuesday.
So, I think with New Jersey, once again, in terms of the presidential level, we're not going to matter at all. And I think we all know that on either side. But, in terms of going down the ballot, a lot of 2020 is going to be about for or against Trump, not even, what's going on in terms of the other side with Joe Biden. But, Trump will definitely have an effect on the ballot, down ballot. He's an overwhelming presence right now between the pandemic and the economy. And those are the two things that are going to drive through to November in terms of deciding not only the primaries, but also the general election.
So how much, now talk about him here in New Jersey. I mean, his numbers are obviously, he's unpopular here, but what about Joe Biden here in New Jersey? Again, his presence, is there a lot of, I think an earlier poll at Eagleton suggested there wasn't a lot of enthusiasm. I think that was a couple of months ago. Has that changed since then? And how does that, do you think, might be shaping what's going to happen on Tuesday?
Right. So, Joe Biden is beating Donald Trump in New Jersey by double digits, but I don't think that's any surprise. He's also been shown to be beating Donald Trump by double digits in national polling as well. But his Biden's favorable numbers are not necessarily overwhelmingly better than we see Trump's. So overall, 31% in the state are favorable of Donald Trump, and 44% say the same about Joe Biden. And in fact, 37% are unfavorable of Joe Biden. So it's not a wide gap that Biden has. He's just the alternative to Trump. But Trump still continues to have, very low numbers in the state. But of course, high numbers among Republicans. And with Joe Biden, he has mediocre numbers at best, even though he's winning the head-to-head right now.
How about you, Matt? How do you see the Trump shadow on this race here, or is that
so I think one of the things that Trump does is he makes everybody angry, and what I mean by that is that he certainly his sort of his racist comments, his chaotic behavior, all of that really makes Democrats froth at the mouth, right? And particularly progressive Democrats who are furious at him. And so that would lead you to believe all these people are going to get out and vote him out of and get rid of him. But at the other hand, he also has a really amazing talent for making his base angry and making his base blame the Democrats and blame the other in a way that motivates them to go out. And so, I think that in many ways, Trump is emblematic of polarizing our country, because he makes both sides, Democrats and Republicans, furious for different reasons. And then, anybody who's in the middle or things like that is kind of left throwing their hands up, but it certainly might be polarizing on both ends.
So, Ben, to Matt's point, the possibility we might see a higher turnout because of this Trump anger and Trump enthusiasm in his base. But does that, I don't know what past practice has been. I mean, usually New Jersey primaries are low turnout affairs, dominated by the county parties and the unions and the special interest groups. Do you think we're going to see a higher than normal turnout for this primary? A lot of people getting their first chance, particularly Democrats, to register their disgust over Trump?
Yes, we're going to see a higher than expected turnout, I would expect, in this primary, but it's not because of Trump. It's because we're going to have all vote by mail system. And what we've done is, look, primaries are situations, I mean, they're intra-party fights. If there's a competitive primary, you see a bump in turnout. If your congressman is running and there's nobody running against them for the primary, then there's a low turnout. And this makes it very different than the November elections, when we will expect to see typically 70% of registered voters voting in November. And this year, I expect that'll be closer to 75, probably. So right now for the primary, the July 7th primary, because of the vote by mail system, marginal voters have received a ballot. It's easy to do. So if you're just a registered Republican, you got a ballot. All you have to do is fill it out. You don't have to put a stamp on it. You just got to put it in the mail. And a lot of people, I think, are taking advantage of that, which makes it very difficult to predict who exactly is going to vote in this upcoming election in the primary. We're not sure really who the universe of voters are going to be.
Well, that's a good question, good point, because back to you, Ashley, on this issue. You guys at Rutgers polled on this issue, I think, a couple months ago, and found that most people, I think it was 54%, said that they support the idea of vote by mail, but most people didn't know when the primary was going to be held.
No, so 54%.
Do you think that that's changed as we get closer to the showtime?
This was at the height of the pandemic when we had done this poll, and we looked at both sides of the issue in terms of, whether it's the health of poll workers and voters versus the increased ballot errors that may happen and the controversy surrounding vote by mail. Of course, we see a huge bipartisan split on this. 3/4 of Republicans say that the primary should not be vote by mail entirely. 7 in 10 Democrats say that it should. This is a very polarizing issue, both statewide and national. And I don't think this is something that would have changed in the past few weeks since we did this poll. This is an enduring issue that will last through November in terms of the partisan splits that we see going on in terms of whether or not we should be voting by mail. There are some really, strong opinions on this when we're talking about Democrats versus Republicans.
Ben, also on the vote by mail, I noticed the governor seemed to be straddling the fence on this. He was kind of anguished about which way to go. Should we go vote by mail, go all out, or maintain the more traditional system? And a lot of this was gaming it at a time when we still hadn't flattened the curve yet on the pandemic. Now things have settled. But do you think his hesitancy was somewhat steered or influenced by the fact that vote by mail has not been widely used in some of the core Democratic constituencies, particularly in urban areas, and also the role of the pandemic? a lot of people were now may not have gotten the ballots at home because they were staying with other family members, for example. I know that was an issue in Philadelphia. I'm just wondering whether you sense that factored in his calculation to go with this hybrid system, which is, I think, is going to add to the confusion of this. But
sure. So there's a couple ways to unpack that. First of all, I think the decision-making process from the governor, the secretary of state, those who had to make these decisions, kept getting put off because they weren't sure. Everything was changing.
Yeah.
Day to day, you weren't sure if now are we going to start going down by next week. And so they put it off. And one of the problems with this election is that the time frame has been truncated. There's been less time for voter education. There's been less time for ballots to be delivered and mailed. The United States Post Office, we have continued to see, has struggled, certainly at the individual carrier level, to handle these things. All of this has been truncated, which means people have not had a chance to get used to it the way you would want to. And one of the reasons, part of that, is really that the state, which should have been doing many more public service announcements to explain there is an election on this new date. Don't go to your typical polling place. Use the vote by mail. Half the polling places have been cut. You're going to show up at the high school and it's going to be closed because that's where I vote. So these kinds of public education campaigns that should have been going on really haven't. And I think that will certainly affect some people.
I totally agree.
Charlie, let me jump in if I can.
Go ahead.
I just, one of the things that I think is interesting about the move to vote by mail is, in general, when places have moved to vote by mail, you do see a bit of a slight uptick in younger people voting and in younger people participating, and perhaps also in sort of polarized people on either end of the spectrum, at least initially. But in part because of what Ben was saying about the lack of education and the truncated nature of this, the parties actually could have a huge advantage for the incumbents and the party line candidates because they've had a vote by mail apparatus, right? They have the lists already together. They have the precinct captains together to know how to get the VBMs out. So you have this sort of interesting tension that vote by mail could lead to an explosion of new types of voters, or it could cement sort of the power of the parties right there. It's going to be really interesting to see that.
If I could add one more quick thing.
Please do.
Yeah. So part of the challenge for these parties and for candidates is that it is incumbent upon them to explain it. So if you're calling a voter, hey, I want you to vote, the first thing you have to do is tell there's an election that's a different date than you ever expected. And there's a new process. And all of that education takes up 5 minutes of the phone call before you even get to, here's why my candidate is good and here's why the other candidate is bad. That has put a tremendous strain on the resources of these campaigns because they have to handle the public education because we don't see ads constantly on TV as you might have hoped.
I agree with your other point too, also, Ben, about the lack of public service announcement. I mean, I watch almost every coronavirus briefing by the governor, and he repeatedly informs people about the census. And go fill out your census form, which is perfectly fine. In fact, he said it so many times, I went and double checked to make sure I did it. I mean, he's been so routine about it, but he has not said one word about the election. And I almost get the impression the election is such a colossal headache for him, or potential headache, that he just really doesn't want to deal with it. If you watch the way he answers those questions that are brought up from time to time about his decisions about the primary, he seems real hesitant, eager to move the discussion away from it. I don't think he's looking forward to administering that. But since I mentioned coronavirus, Ashley, how much do you think that's going to be a fuel in this, or shape or influence the turnout before we get to speaking to some. I want to get to move on to some of the individual races, but what's your take on the pandemic and particularly New Jersey's response to it?
Sure. Again, I think this is going to go down partisan lines. I think we've seen a national trend where the pandemic is getting more and more politicized. And we had told a few weeks back, there was a lot of bipartisan support, including for the governor. There was bipartisan or nonpartisan, coalescing of attitudes and behaviors in terms of, how worried people were, how it was affecting them. But I think this pandemic is a slow burn that's becoming more and more politicized because it's something that doesn't stop. We had issues with Election Day when it came to Hurricane Sandy, but that was a moment in time, whereas the pandemic is something that's ongoing. So whether or not we flatten the curve, whether or not we're opening up in stages 1 or 2 or whatnot, the pandemic hasn't gone away. But the beliefs and the perceptions about the pandemic are becoming highly politicized and polarized, and that's going to play in terms of how people feel about going out to the polls to vote and whether or not they're going to vote by mail. And like Ben had pointed out, it's the simple fact that primaries are usually low interest elections and people don't really know about them. And in our results a few weeks back, 6% knew that it's happening on July 7th, that it's been moved to there. In fact, 3% knew that it was happening on the original date. So without any type of education, Democrat, Independent, Republican alike, people don't know that this is happening or that it's going on, regardless of how they intend to vote.
Both of you have just given me a couple good column ideas on this public service announcement thing. I'm going to thank you very much for that. But how about you, Matt, on Ashley's point about the pandemic being politicized? How do you see that breaking down along partisan lines, and how we might see it reflected on Tuesday?
Well, I think that there is a sizable number of folks, maybe across the aisle, that are so sick of being inside, so sick of, that are really starting to get frustrated, and they're expressing that and they're saying that, but then the other side of the aisle is people are terrified of it, and so the polarization that you're seeing in our politics is sort of representing itself in kind of the public health issue as well. It's like people aren't thinking about it in terms of politics. They're thinking about it in terms of their life. And they're thinking about, I have to get out. My kids have to get to camp. They have to get to school. I can't stand this anymore. This is enough. I want to go eat at a restaurant. And then other people are saying, let's have masks and shut down the world forever. And so I'm not sure that people are thinking about it as solely in terms of politics of who's right or who's wrong. I think they're making decisions, and that's polarizing again. That's sort of splitting us in two. And unfortunately, that's sort of where our society is right now.
And we also have a governor who we saw very high marks in your poll, Ashley, and I believe it was the Monmouth poll that also gave him, I think, up to 70% approval rating. And he's going to be a figure. I think he's particularly in one race. But how do you think, Ben, that with Murphy's handling, that's going to have any bearing at all on Tuesday?
You were asking me?
Yes, it's crisis management. Yeah.
Look, the governor has a very difficult needle to thread, and he has tried to rely on medical science to drive a lot of his decision making. Yeah. But as we have now on the downside, we are flattening the curve here in New Jersey. The numbers are decreasing. Now we have to talk about how you manage the opening. And so he may well have done, I think a lot of high marks came when we were managing a crisis. Mm-hmm. But now when it comes to finding a way to open up from the crisis, that is really hard. And he's got to have to balance the medical science with the social science. Mm-hmm. You have legislators who aren't able to do anything because Governor Murphy is operating under emergency powers that have been granted him. But those emergency powers are as has been referenced before, when we have a Superstorm Sandy and you just need somebody in charge to make some big decisions right then. They weren't designed to last 15 weeks, which is effectively what we've been doing.
Right.
And so people who involved in the political process are a little bit frustrated, and everybody is agitated, not just because I'm stuck in my house with my kids and they don't have school and they don't have camp and I don't know, and I'm trying to work. If I have work and we're trying to pay, all of those issues are there. And on top of it, you can't complain to anybody because effectively one person is really getting to make these decisions. Mm-hmm. It's not an enviable position to be in. But I'm not sure it's going to drive anybody in terms of their love-hate for Phil Murphy in this primary. Those are more localized and candidate-based elections.
Right. And is there going to be any spillover in congressional races, which are really we have Cory Booker's on the ballot at the top of he's running for re-election against Larry Hamm, a well-known community activist in Newark. But do you see any of that angst that you're talking about spilling over into turnout in these races? In
the primaries, no. I don't really think that it's going to matter much. Mm-hmm. And come November, we were talking earlier about Trump's role, the shadow he casts over everything. Yeah, his opinion is my take. He's baked in to everybody's equation. People know whether they like him or they don't like him. And everything that happens in a news cycle simply reinforces that view. So I'm not sure anybody's really being convinced one way or the other about it's just there. We're waiting to get to the day when you can vote and just cast the ballot. So he will be a huge influence, but he's almost the thing you don't have to mention because everybody knows that Donald Trump is on the ballot and you're either going to endorse a second term or you're not.
I want to move to a couple of the races that are garnering a lot of attention, particularly in South Jersey, which normally is not the biggest hotbed of political activity. But this year it is because we had the decision by Jeff Van Drew at the end of Congressman Jeff Van Drew was a freshman congressman from the 2nd District who defected and became a national news story back in December, joined the Republican Party, and a grateful Donald Trump rewarded him with a visit at a rally in January. And that has created a scramble for on the Democratic side to take him on. And what we have seen now is we have 3 candidates primarily on the Democratic side. Will Cunningham, a progressive who is a former aide to Cory Booker. But the 2 leading candidates or prominent candidates are Amy Kennedy, who is married to the former Rhode Island congressman and son of Patrick Kennedy and son of Ted Kennedy, who lives in Brigantine, a former teacher. And she is facing Bridget Harrison, we all know as a political analyst and a professor at Montclair State University. I find this to be really fascinating because both of them are trying to position themselves as sort of left of center progressives. But how do you see this race shaping up? Is this really an opportunity, really a referendum on 2 progressive candidates, or is this really something? Or are they really proxy for something wider or bigger or different? Let me start with you, Matt.
Well, I think there are differences between the 2 candidates. I think that you could certainly make an argument that Kennedy is farther on the progressive side than Harrison is. I think that Harrison is more of a traditional and a centrist Democrat, and I think Kennedy is a sort of a traditional Kennedy liberal in many respects. And what's interesting is that I think this could be a possibility of Democrats winning a battle and losing the war. I think that there's at least a possibility that Kennedy might prevail in the primary, as the progressive candidate, but then lose badly in the general. I think that Harrison, as perhaps more of the centrist candidate, is more likely and better able to appeal to the district. It is not a progressive district for the most part. It might be changing a little bit as people move in from Philadelphia and other places, but it's in general, it's a pretty conservative district, and a centrist Democrat, I think, in November has a much better chance than a progressive Democrat, which got to get out of the primary first. And so, I think that they both have, progressive credentials, but I do think there is a difference between the two. And again, it goes back to the turnout. Who's going to show up? Is it the party faithful and the longtime centrist Democrats that have been a big part of that district for a long time, or is it the new progressives who are making noise? So it'll be an interesting race.
Ben, there seems to be a lot of enthusiasm among the progressives. They rallied around Amy Koning, her candidacy, but I have a tough time believing that corner of South Jersey. I went to high school down there, but that was back at the dawn of time. But during the Charles Sandman era, I'll give you a little marker on things. But I have a tough time believing that there is this reservoir of untapped progressive Democrats down there.
Well, in the primary election, those folks may well be motivated. You have a strong, very strong South Jersey Democratic organization. And for the most part, that organizational support has been given to Bridget Harrison. Amy Kennedy has made a particular play to accentuate that, and many of the progressive activists who are on her side have made a big play of that, saying, look, this is the reformer against the organization. I think that makes for a nice narrative in a newspaper article. I'm not sure it really carries the entire weight and narrative of what's going on. First of all, Harrison has criticized organizations and folks at various times. We know her public commentary and her history. And Kennedy certainly worked very hard to get the organization support in Atlantic City from the Callaway organization, which is the dominant group dominating the biggest city inside this district. Atlantic County provides generally, in a typical election, about 40% of the vote here. So winning that, which is the biggest of the 7 or so counties that have a slice of this. However, Harrison, because the South Jersey organization backs her, and the South Jersey Democratic organization has been much more sophisticated than almost any other political organization in the state, much more sophisticated in using vote by mail. The key to vote by mail turnout is to get the person used to it. The first time is hard, but the second time you've done it, so now it's easier. Because the South Jersey Democratic organization supporting Harrison may have a more sophisticated VBM, vote by mail strategy, and their people, their core voters may be more used to doing it, will have an easier time of doing it. That should give her a little bit of an edge in this thing. But it's important to note, and this is my last point, so many ballots are out there because any registered Democrat simply received automatically a ballot under the current rules for this election.
Right.
So many ballots in transit, no real model exists on who's going to vote, who's going to take that moment and a few moments to fill in that ballot. So it's hard to make a prediction here.
Let me just an aside, Ashley. In some of your polling on vote by mail, did you uncover any of those potential concerns that Ben just alluded to with voters, that they're just they're new to it, B, they're sort of they haven't had the experience, and that they might find it confusing or disregard it altogether, maybe?
Unfortunately, I wish we did a whole poll on vote by mail because it's such an intricate, in-depth topic, to go into. Unfortunately, we didn't ask any of that. But I think, we see throughout polling in general that these things are hard for voters to grasp. I mean, we asked a couple years ago when it was our 200th poll about whether or not they even knew their state legislators. So, I mean, these are things, especially at the local level, despite how important local politics is, these are things that voters, unfortunately, most of them do not grasp very well. So, they would certainly have trouble with in terms of, especially without any kind of big PSA campaign, how to do this, what this means, what the process is. And like Ben said, it makes the model even more confusing for who will, quote unquote, turn out on election day, whether that's, via snail mail or in person at a poll. It makes it that much more difficult to predict. I mean, the elections are notoriously difficult to predict who's going to turn out to begin with. And, especially when it comes to primaries, and now especially when we're using a whole different system.
Back to your point, Ben, about the narrative in the second district campaign, that I think the narrative you're alluding to is that Bridget Harrison is the machine candidate backed by the South Jersey Democratic apparatus, George Norcross, Steve Sweeney, and they quickly fell in line behind her 6 of the 8 counties in South Jersey. And so she's being painted as a pawn of the machine. But isn't that undercut by the Kennedys' reliance on the Callaway operation in Atlantic City? I mean, isn't that, kind of undercut that narrative?
Yes, but let us, that doesn't matter to some people. So yes, it's undercut.
Right.
And I think other people have an easier time just framing this as machine versus reformer, even if it's not quite that. These are two candidates, outside of marijuana, they're pretty much the same on all of the major Democratic issues.
Mm-hmm.
And so you just have, two people coming at it, with different personalities. And so people are looking for a way to divide who's on what side, if I don't really know a lot about these folks. And this becomes an easy way, even as we've tried to talk about here, it's not a complete, it doesn't play that way. It doesn't divide that way easily. It makes sense to a lot of folks, and so that's why they'll use it.
Matt, do you think the Kennedy aura helps bolster the sheen or burnish or give Kennedy an advantage, Amy Kennedy an advantage in this debate that we're talking about? I think the Kennedy machine politics, maybe it's glossed over because she's a Kennedy.
I actually think the Kennedy name can be hugely important every place except the second district. I mean, I really think that in some respects the Kennedy name could be a thorn and a pain in the second district and hurt her with some of the white, some of the voters who think of Kennedy as sort of the big spending liberal. That's not the primary. I think that's back to the point of how this might. The Kennedy name in the general election, I think, can be used as a weapon against her. Maybe not so much in the primary, but I don't think that holds as much in that district as it might in other places.
How do you see that, Ben? You think it's
I'd agree. I'm not sure it makes as much of a difference here. People are going to be organized because they're able to be educated on how to turn in a ballot, and they're going to be asked to do so. And, so this is going to come down less about name, because it's not like they were going to do this anyway. That is, in a general election, in a presidential year, people are going to the ballot, and therefore, you use a name because you have an association for what that name means, and you can go from there. In a primary election, you still have to be educated and motivated to do something. Now that number is expanded because we made it so easy by giving all these people vote by mail ballots. But at the same time, I'm not sure it's going to have much of an impact at all. The name itself in this election.
I think that the organization of getting people to know about the election, to turn in the VBM, and having that apparatus together. I think that's going to matter a lot more than the name.
All right, one more quick question about this race. Is this also because of Governor Murphy? Governor Murphy's endorsement of Amy Kennedy, which seemed to catch some people by surprise. He kind of lulled people into thinking maybe he wasn't going to get involved. But do you think his endorsement has now made this a proxy fight and a continuation of the proxy fight we see here in Trenton? Murphy and his progressive allies trying to weaken or destroy the South Jersey Norcross machine. This is another skirmish in the long war. Ben, I'll go with you on that.
Okay.
And Ashley.
It certainly lends itself to that reading of it. I mean, I think a lot of us were surprised that the governor jumped in as he did, especially in a race that could be very close. So maybe he's looking at some numbers that we don't know or expects it. I think the governor faced a lot of pressure from his progressive supporters who wanted him to weigh in on this because they saw it as a proxy battle. And they didn't want to go into this battle, which they see as a reform versus machine fight, without the 70% approval rating governor on their side. So even if he had been hesitant to get involved in an intra-party Democratic fight with two people he could probably work very well with, he weighed in, I think in large part because of his supporters demanded it of him.
You know, I think it's another example of Governor Murphy dances with the one that brung him, and he routinely reaches out to the progressive community, oftentimes in places he doesn't necessarily have to. I don't think anyone would have held it against him if he sat this one out, but he certainly furnished his progressive credentials again by jumping in on it. And it's interesting because, Charlie, you were saying earlier that in his briefings for COVID, he barely talks about the election. He barely seems like he's interested.
Right.
But he jumped into this one, and he jumped in, I think there could be a downside for him if he loses. If Harrison ends up winning, then, there's another narrative that people start writing about that, the governor backed the wrong side. The governor doesn't have real power. He got beat again, and that's gone away during COVID. But that narrative could come back so there's a bit of a risk to him, I think.
Well, finally, now I want to move on to the third district, Burlington, Ocean County district. Two Republicans are going at it hammer and tong. David Richter, a former CEO with Hale International, a construction management firm, against Kate Gibbs, a former Burlington County freeholder. I've never seen a Republican primary get this nasty. Or maybe I could probably, if I really summon up my memory, I'm sure I could find a few municipal races. But this is getting ugly. Why has this gotten to be so ugly? What are the dynamics that have led to this level of mudslinging? Ben, maybe you want to handle that one.
Okay.
I think you live near there too. So
I'm not in that district, but I'm nearby.
Nearby, right? The TV ads.
Look, there are several different conflicts that have set up here. You have the male versus female conflict that is set up in part because Kate Gibbs was running, and then Richter, who was running in the first district, decided to switch. And jump into this one and was talked to and recruited. And there's a perception it was a bunch of white guys who basically got together and got a rich white guy to come in and to knock the woman away. You have Burlington County versus Ocean County, which are the two big divisions geographically in this district. You have a background issue, sort of country club Republican versus a person who grew up much more working class. Works for a labor union. That's Kate Gibbs. So with all of these tensions there, you have two candidates who I think, in an honest appraisal, both have flaws, or at least material that one can exploit in a campaign. So it's been easy to attack each other because there's material. And all of this kind of conflict that we've seen manifests itself in negative ads because they're not making stuff up. There's stuff there that each of them has.
And they're both Trump loyalists too, which I think is interesting, and that'll see how that plays out, or whether that comes back to haunt them in the general. But
it's about the only thing that unites them.
It is. That's a one common ground issue that does unite us. Ashley, what about the danger of the Republican Party? I mean, it's rare. The Republican Party has suffered from the gender gap for years, and it's just widened. Here they finally have this candidate, and that seems to be initially a consensus candidate initially, and now you have half the party or a prominent party tearing her down. What's the risk for the Republicans doing something like this, or is this just so localized that it doesn't really matter?
So it's a little bit of all of the above. We see that gender plays a different role within each of the parties, and it's something that is prominent within the Democratic Party in terms of descriptive representation, not just substantive representation. When we're talking about the Republican Party, they have a very different idea in terms of whether or not it matters to have this type of gender parity. And we see this through the academic literature and whatnot in terms of how the parties perceive the role of gender within the party and what equality means to them, and whether it's, getting that descriptive representation or the best candidate to win. So number one, the race is highly localized. And number two, it's not necessarily something that would be fuel for the fire for the Republican Party to say, we have a woman candidate, let's proceed with this woman candidate and make sure she gets in. So, it's something that is viewed very differently based on what side of the aisle that you're on.
And finally, Matt, catching some of us by surprise is that Albio Series, who could just sleepwalk his way through a primary, is now suddenly taking challenger Bernie Sanders' challenger very seriously. Is he concerned that he's going to face an Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez moment up there? And, having someone from the left kind of sting him without, hitting him from behind without him seeing it.
Well, he's concerned enough to turn on his Twitter account. So, I think that's a recognition that his opponent is making some noise, and his opponent is making more noise than they thought he was going to. I do think at the end of the day that it's going to be more sound than fury, and I think that Series is probably going to be quite safe. But it is part and parcel of seeing Democrats getting challenged from the left. Nobody wants to be AOC, and nobody wants that to happen. I do think that in order for that to happen, you have to have a candidate who has the media skills that she does. And I don't know that any of the sort of progressive challengers are sort of on that level. But he's concerned enough that he's getting the endorsements out. He's concerned enough that he's kicking the machine in as much as he can. I think he's going to be safe, but it's not a sleepwalk in the park.
Okay. Well, listen, this ink-stained scribe wants to thank you for all three of you for helping me shape my media skills here. This new Zoom interviewing, like Zoom. I don't want to. It's a different software. Teleconferencing form of interviewing. It's been a real pleasure. I could talk all day. I know you guys all have things to take care of. And Ashley has a newborn to, on top of everything else to take care of. And I really, congratulations, Ashley. I really appreciate you stepping up and helping us. And my name's Charlie Stile at the NorthJersey.com, The Record. And thank you very much for tuning in, and go out and vote, or get to your mailbox and vote before July 7th. Take care.